The largest debate of all within the realm of repositories is whether or not to return IQueryable from a repository class method. So if you take a look at this article again, we've already looked here once to talk about return types, IEnumerable versus IList, remember that? This author does a great job in this article of talking about the issue at hand. And so, for example, you have this iRepository book interface that returns an iQueryable of book called books, and then he actually implements it here with a simple iQueryable of book, and it returns the object context dot books, which is essentially just an entities, a collection of entities of type book. Okay, and then using it like so. Once you have an instance of the book repository, then you can just go bookrepository.books.where and then give it some lambda expression like he did here. All right. And so the idea seems to have a lot of support, if for no other reason than the sheer convenience of it. I mean, look what you get to do here. You still have a repository, right? And you get to use these link extension methods like the where extension method and pass in these lambda expressions like we're used to working with in link to entities and other link style syntaxes. So here's actually one good jumping off point where different opinions are espoused about this, and there are plenty of debates about this exact same question: should repositories return iQueryable or not, throughout the internet, especially on Stack Exchange, Programmers Exchange, all that kind of stuff. All right. But what I want to do is start back and kind of explain this from the beginning, and talk first of all about what iQueryable actually is. And so I want to take a look at its MSDN entry. And if you scroll down to the remarks section at the very bottom, in fact, it's kind of long, so let's go all the way to the bottom here. And you can see that it says that the iQueryable of T interface is intended for implementation by query providers. What is a query provider? Well, this is an old explanation at this URL. And it's pretty intense, let me tell you. But my takeaway from the article is that a query provider is a pretty low-level mechanism. It's the foundation for link itself. It turns methods or link syntax into expression trees. One step up from the base query provider, you have a link query provider, which allows you to create things like link to SQL, link to entities, link to objects, or custom versions like link to Amazon or link to Flickr or link to whatever. If you have a proprietary file format and you want to create a link to my proprietary file format, then you would use iQueryable and you'd follow the instructions in this series of articles created by Matt Warren at Microsoft. In other words, iQueryable was never really intended to be used for the purpose that people are using it. In other words, to be used as a means to build a query object and have it executed to retrieve results from linked to entities or whatever your underlying data store is. Apparently, it can be repurposed for this, but that was never its original intent. Still, that doesn't mean you shouldn't use it, right? I mean, you can use it for that purpose. Obviously, people have been using it, so what's wrong with that? Well, I guess, that's correct. Personally, for me, that would be enough to scare me away from it. However, there are other factors to consider. So let me give you the reasons why many people who are more knowledgeable than I am, like the articles that we've already looked at, like this gentleman here and a couple of others we'll visit here in just a moment, why they eschew the practice of returning iQueryable of T from your repository methods. So let's start with reason number one. Returning iQueryable of T from your repository methods creates a leaky abstraction. So when you do this in your client code, presumably inside of a method inside of your domain layer class, something that looks like this example that he's created here, and I've just used my favorite author B.V. Larson, who you can find on Amazon. bookrepo.books.where and then pass in some lambda expression. You're getting back an iQueryable of book. But what is book? In this case, it's an entity from the entity framework. You're using the entity framework inside the domain layer. Sure, you created an abstraction by adding a persistence layer to encapsulate the data access technology. You abstracted away the data access technology, and you did a great job of making sure your domain layer technology is agnostic. It's persistent ignorant, all right? But then you turned around and you allowed that abstraction to leak back into the domain layer. Now your domain layer is no longer persistent ignorant. It's no longer technology agnostic. Instead, it's tied to the entity framework, or at a minimum, you're tied to a data access technology that implements IQueryable of T. Now, admittedly, you say IQueryable of T is part of the .NET Framework base class library, and Link is part of C#. So while you have, in essence, tied your app to IQueryable and you're building a query that will eventually be executed against the entity framework, in reality, that should never really be a problem, right? After all, Microsoft would never remove Link or IQueryable of T from C# and the .NET Framework class library, respectively. Well, that might be true, but what happens when the expression you define in the domain layer to execute against your database is nonsensical? You'll get a not supported exception in the domain layer. As Mark Seaman points out, many people have encountered this. In fact, he refers you to just do a search for link not supported exception, and you get a bunch of people who run into this exact problem. And the question is, do you want to handle link to entities or any other data access technology specific exceptions in your domain layer? No matter what, the entity framework or some other specific data access technology will wind up leaking into your domain layer. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, returning IQueryable T from your repository methods changes the intent of the repository, and it confuses the delegation of responsibilities for each layer. So when you return IQueryable of T from your repository, it's no longer a repository per se. It becomes something entirely different. Remember the intent of the repository pattern. It's there to provide a simple layer that isolates domain objects from the details of the database access code, per Martin Fowler. The query logic is all encapsulated inside of the repository. When queries are executed, we return a collection of data transfer objects. Data access technology agnostic DTOs, mind you. This further serves to keep the isolation in check. And what is the DTO but a simplified data structure that can be easily turned into instances of classes in the domain model using something like AutoMapper or just writing it all by hand, right? But when you return IQueryable, you're now returning an empty question that's ready to be asked, okay? You'll tack on predicates like where clauses using the where extension method and other expressions to shape and mold the result. So you're given an empty query, and then in the domain layer classes, you begin to fill it up. So the query logic is no longer encapsulated inside the repository. The domain layer classes are now responsible for the query logic. The domain layer also gets a whiff of the data access technology that's being used, like we said in the previous reason. So this is a matter of delegating responsibilities to the proper layer. Do you want to delegate the responsibility of query creation to the domain layer? I think this article says it well. The repository pattern in IQueryable. Again, Sapiens Works. This guy does an awesome job of explaining these types of things. And where does he say it here? He says an IQueryable is pretty much a query builder, and it's great for that. A repository method returns some business object or model, what we've been calling a DTO. Can you spot the difference? You ask the repository to give you a model. How the repository comes up with a model is its problem. The point is that using IQueryable, you're asking for a query builder and not for a model. A query builder specifies how the query should be, how to get the data. Then why are you using a repository? Isn't the repo's job to know how to get the thing that we want? We're using the repository because we want to specify what to get, not how to get it. If you want to have full control over how to get the model, then you don't need a repository. Use IQueryable or some other builder for that purpose. But if you don't care how or where from the model is retrieved, use a repository whose methods return only a model or an enumerable of models. Let the repository do its job of hiding the implementation details. Use it as an abstraction. Tell it the what, not the how. I love how he said that. Okay, if after all of this, IQueryable of T still doesn't offend you, if you know that you'll never use another data access technology, then I would have to ask why you even feel like you need a repository in the first place. To just check a check mark off of your architecture design? Just be done with the charade. Use linked to entities or your data access technology of choice directly in the domain layer. Some, in fact, have chosen to do just that. And in a small app with a short time frame with adequate buy-in from management, I suppose that's just okay. We've already talked about this in the application architecture series. I'll have more to say about that near the end of the series in a lesson titled, Do We Even Need Repositories? So Mark Seaman essentially says this in his blog post. Programmers who define such interfaces invariably have a specific ORM, object relational mapper, in mind, and they implicitly tend to stay within the bounds they know are safe for that specific ORM. This is a leaky abstraction. If you have a specific ORM in mind, then be explicit about it. Don't hide behind an interface. It creates the illusion that you can replace one implementation with another. In practice, that's impossible. Imagine attempting to provide an implementation over an event store. All right. So the third reason then is unit testability. And there's a good article here. Once again, I'm going to point you back to this article titled, Should You Return IQueryable from Your Repositories? He says, starting here, half the point of compartmentalizing your data persistence logic into repositories is so that you can isolate and test that logic. If you're passing the buck up to the domain logic level, then you're no longer able to test data persistence logic and domain logic by itself. In my opinion, it completely breaks separation of concerns. You can't unit test a property of type IQueryable because you couldn't possibly account for all the logic possibilities that could be handed off from your domain logic. The person writing the domain logic is completely responsible for writing sound queries against the database. That's just absurd in my humble opinion. Even advocates of returning the IQueryable of T from repository methods admit that they sacrifice testability for convenience. I've made a case for unit testing in the other architecture series. Without unit testing, you're not engineering a product for the inevitability of change. I would hate to be responsible for that code base. It's already legacy code because nobody really knows how a change will impact the system. I would only forego unit testing if I could remove my name from the project. Also in the remainder of this article, the author advocates the simple repository using finder methods or get methods on the repository classes. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, that's what I advocate as well. All right, reason number 4, returning IQueryable APIs from your repository methods obscures their intent. Again, I'm going to rely on Mark Seaman's brilliant blog entitled IQueryable is Tight Coupling. Okay, I guess I did have it here after all. There we go. All right, so to summarize what he basically says, he calls on Postel's law, also known as the robustness principle, which talks about designing systems in a very broad sense. So from Wikipedia, it says, Postel's law says, be conservative in what you do, be liberal in what you accept from others, often reworded as be conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you accept. So Mark Seaman's argument is that by returning, or rather by sending IQueryable from your repository methods, you're promising to return a full implementation of IQueryable. We've already seen that a full implementation of IQueryable is a big promise to make, and each technology implements parts of it differently, thus violating Liskow's substitution principle, or rather LSP, the L in solid by Robert Martin, a whole other story. But admittedly, Mark's argument is pretty heady, and while I understand it at a theoretical level, if I attempted to improve on his response, I would do it an injustice, so please read this article on your own. And finally, reason number 5, IQueryable of T will create unanticipated queries. In a nutshell, the intent of using IQueryable of T is so that you can add link extension methods to add custom queries against the repository directly from the domain layer. The intent is for that IQueryable of T to flow through the repository then, and then be turned into SQL by the entity framework, and then have it executed against the data store like SQL Server. However, is that really a good idea? As I noted earlier, you could create a query so contrived that it would bring the data store like SQL Server to its knees. Actually this article here, once again, let me go all the way up. You know that one, Testability in the Entity Framework 4.0. It says, yeah, here. IQueryable of T allows link expression trees to flow into the EF4 provider and give the provider a holistic view of the query. A second option would be to return IEnumerable of T, which means the EF4 link provider will only see expressions built inside of the repository. That's what we want to do. Any grouping, ordering, and projection done outside of the repository will not be composed into the SQL command sent to the database, which can hurt performance. On the other hand, a repository returning only IEnumerable of T results will never surprise you with a new SQL command. Both approaches will work, and both approaches remain testable. I would tack onto that, though, that both approaches are not predictable ahead of time. You are allowing the domain layer then to create new queries on the fly whenever the developer of the domain layer decides that he wants to tack on some additional functionality. All right, so this is why I prefer not to allow IQueryable of T. IQueryable of T allows for an ad hoc style of usage which is awfully convenient for the developer, but is unpredictable. To restate the author's sentence another way, IQueryable of T may occasionally surprise you with a new SQL command. I don't like surprises, neither do end users or database administrators. So the conclusion is this. I've taken the position that I don't like a repository method returning IQueryable of T. Yes, it can be awfully convenient, but there's always a convenience charge. That's what we've been trying to avoid throughout all the architecture series on LearnVisualStudio.net. But what if you're really committed to introducing IQueryable of T into your repository? I would probably advocate just skipping the repository and the persistence layer altogether and just go ahead and mix the data access and domain responsibilities in the same code rather than to pretend to keep things separate. IQueryable of T is not unit testable, so you've already lost that. Your abstraction is leaky to some degree, so you've already lost that too. At that point, you might as well just finish the app quickly, change your address, and move on to the next project before your sins find you out. All right. Admittedly, I'm being a little facetious here. In all things, it depends. Also, if you have a strong personality on your team that insists on using IQueryable of T, at least armed with this knowledge, you can play devil's advocate. You can sit back and you can watch him squirm as you ask him questions to justify it. That's always fun. All right, so we're moving through this. Hopefully you can see now there are good ways and less good ways to implement repositories. And let's continue on with this idea in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks.